Hi, welcome to this event about brain wellness, genomic justice, and Indigenous communities. I'm Louise Harding, and I'm a master's student at UBC, and I've organized this community conversation as part of my role, both as a graduate fellow at the W. Maurice Young Center for Applied Ethics and as a graduate student in Neuroethics Canada. And I thank both of them for support in putting on this event. Dr. Krystal Tsosie is a visiting scholar at the W. Maurice Young Center for Applied Ethics this week. And this is the second and final event we've been so privileged to have her present at. So welcome again, Dr. Tsosie, and thank you so much for being with us. So I'm going to introduce the event a little bit and then come back to introducing all of the panelists. So Neuroethics Canada Neuroethics Community Conversations are a series that Neuroethics Canada has been running to bring ethics topics that we're working with in the lab into the community. So before COVID, these would be held in public forums like community centers. I attended one down in Olympic Village Community Center. And for now, we're holding them virtually. And thank you so much for joining us today. So before moving forward, I want to acknowledge that it is Indigenous History Month right now. And to acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And as a settler, I acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest on these lands, as the territory was never given over to settlers through treaty or any other means in this area. And I invite you to let us know in the chat if you like whose territories you're joining us from, or a little bit about yourself as I start to introduce the speakers. So I'm going to start by introducing Elder Bryce Mercredi and then hand over to him. So Elder Bryce Mercredi is of Métis heritage from Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and has lived on Vancouver Island for 40 years, 10 years in Port Hardy and the remainder in Comox. And his ancestry is with the fur trade and exploration of the North. He is an elder in residence in the Comox Valley School District. Over to you.
Thank you, Louise. And thank you to the panel and to all our visitors. Welcome. I'm calling from the unceded territory of the beautiful Comox Valley of the Comox First Nation. It's a rainy, dull, dreary day as Dr. Wieman is experiencing there, getting soaking wet. Anyway, I will start this off with a prayer. O Great Spirit, help me always to speak the truth quietly, to listen with an open mind when others speak, and to remember the peace that may be found in silence. All my relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 4 more wonderful panelists today for the conversation. I'm going to give the rest of the introduction for Dr. Tsosie to start. So Dr. Krystal Tsosie holds a PhD, MPH, and MA, and her research centers on ethical engagement with Indigenous communities regarding precision health. She incorporates interests in genetic epidemiology, public health, health AI, and genetic counseling related to Indigenous data sovereignty. She co-founded the Native BioData Consortium, the first Indigenous biological and data repository for US tribal nations. She will be the first Indigenous geneticist at Arizona State University, thus advancing Indigenous-led approaches to genomic data equity. Dr. Malcolm King is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and a health researcher at the University of Saskatchewan. His research is aimed at improving wellness and achieving health equity for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit through strengths-based approaches that respect self-determination and privilege Indigenous ways of knowing. Sekani Dakelth is from the Dakelth Nation, and she is honored and proud to be part of the work that is going on to add the mental wellness issues for First Nations communities. She has much lived experience around marginalized identities and brings her wisdom and insight to many conversations. Lately, she's been co-facilitating and developing workshops to address the opioid epidemic among First Nations communities. Dr. Nell Wieman works as for the First Nations Health Authority, the FNHA, in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer as the Acting Deputy Chief Medical Officer. She is Anishinaabe and a member of the Little Grand Rapids First Nations in Manitoba. She is Canada's first female Indigenous psychiatrist and has more than 20 years clinical experience working with Indigenous people in both rural, reserve, and urban settings. So, welcoming back Elder Bryce onto the screen as well. Great. So I have a set of questions to move through today around the main topics of the event. They're around three themes: data sovereignty to start, centering community voices next, and then brain wellness. As the participants, feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity if you want to turn your camera on and ask any questions directly. So to start us off around data sovereignty, Dr. Tsosie, could you start by telling us a little bit about what data sovereignty means? Why is this concept so important when it comes to collecting and researching Indigenous people's DNA?
Yeah, thank you so much for those kind introductions and also for the invite. I don't think I've introduced myself in the context of the new attendees who have joined the room. So yeah, today, everyone, I introduced my clans, then I introduced my name, Indigenous, which is my language. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Thank you for also introducing my professional affiliations and interests. So to answer your question, Indigenous data sovereignty is really not a new concept, but it is fundamentally the right for Indigenous nations and peoples to exercise authority, agency, and autonomy for decisions related to their own data. And this is incredibly important. So my background is actually as a geneticist, but we really cannot do genetics without also due concern to ethics. When I first started as an undergraduate student in the life sciences, one of the first things that I realized was that there just aren't that many Indigenous peoples in the sciences, in particular in genetics. And it really doesn't take that much of reading to understand that there have been a lot of sustained and ongoing controversies related to genomics and genetics in Indigenous communities within the last, couple decades, or even ongoing right now. And it's actually a shame that not enough non-Indigenous scientists understand all of the ethical controversies that they are perpetuating, either knowingly or unknowingly, on Indigenous nations. For instance, a very infamous case is when the Havasupai Nation sued Arizona State University researchers for violations of trust related to uninformed or unconsented use of their DNA and data, such that they were using genetic factors that they collected from people that people thought were being used to study type 2 diabetes, to study other things like schizophrenia, allegations of inbreeding, which is culturally inconsistent with their culture, and also for narratives, origin narratives that were incongruent with their own stories. And in Canada in particular, you are undergoing you have been, like the United States has been undergoing a really tough time related with your government's relationship with Indigenous peoples, especially in the past 1 to 2 years. And the theft and the interest of collecting Indigenous DNA is actually really right now, especially when you think about the ability to co-opt and commercialize and privatize Indigenous genetic information onto the next sequencing platform or whatever the next innovation genomics is going to be. So, these concerns about commercialization have been ongoing for a really long time, and it's up now for Indigenous peoples to be able to exercise our right to take ownership and to state that if there are going to be benefits about research benefits from our data, then we need to be the people to benefit first, not corporations, not researchers. And then also, I'll just leave it at this, that we really need to think about also advancing just our knowledge and of legal protections for ensuring, again, that we're the first people to benefit from our DNA and from our data. And that we're, even though my domain is in genetic data, this can be applied to really any kind of data, cultural knowledges, environmental data, and in the context of today's talk, neurological and neuroscience and behavioral data. So thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Super helpful place to start off. Dr. King, and as well as Sekani, the next question is to you, based on our call last week, kind of preparing for this talk. You both talked a little bit about data sovereignty in the context of research that collects community knowledge, stories. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about this, things like community control and storage of the data. Either one of you can start.
Hi, everyone. Again, so I think when it comes to like just data sovereignty is what I wanted to talk a little bit about, and how I noticed my nation, like where I'm from, we have a gathering of 6 different nations under the Sekani Tribal Council. So we have a tribal council that acts as an advocate and a liaison and pushes for rights and title. Now, with that said, each of our nations are separate and different, and I noticed that a lot of times we're fighting to keep our differences, but we're also like in a state of where we don't have the capacity to take on this more work, right? So I'm always out here trying to advocate, like, and I notice other Indigenous folks, young folks who are like, we really need to get together on some things, because I noticed there are some nations that have a huge amount of capacity and funding and really, really amazing folks that are working for their nations. But when I think of where I am, I'm in a small community of 2,000, I think is the most we've had here. And when I think of my nation, which is just next door to where I am, there is less folks than that, and they're struggling just to keep their band operating, so like capacity for work is hard. So I definitely wanted to mention that part when I think of data sovereignty and thinking of how does my community take it on, because I did a lot of research for the last 5 years, and I did many boring days of analyzing transcript and finding out the themes and picking out all these sentences to fit under each theme. But we always had like this control group, and our control group was the person that was really hard to reach and the person that was very isolated and didn't have a lot of access to technology. We always had that person in mind. And when I think we go forward into looking at data sovereignty, how do we help those nations that are struggling and not able to I guess take that work on, because it would be work and it would be us, and I'm all for our nations deciding what's best for our nation, right? But when it comes to like data sovereignty and wellness, brain wellness, I feel like that's a huge issue that affects a lot of our nations. We're all left with a lot of the effects of colonization are still very ripe and rampant in our community, and it's affecting us mentally and physically and spiritually, right? So yeah, I want folks to consider that when we're starting to move forward. There's something so powerful of being able to go to another nation and to lean on each other.
Thanks so much for that community perspective. Dr. King.
Yes, so I'd like to add to what Sekani has to say And this is the community voice, the community aspects of data sovereignty. So many of us come from fairly small communities. I come from a community of less than 2,000 people, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm related to a whole lot of people in my community, and so the community needs to have a voice in the data sovereignty, not just individuals. I mean, we are our own people, of course, and we need to have control over our own bodies, our own data, but our communities need. So if a researcher were to come to my community and recruit 3 of my cousins, basically, as I understand genomics, I'm not an expert in that area, but they would already know just about everything they needed to know about me, and yet they hadn't even asked my permission or collected any samples for me. So it's important for our communities to have a say in genomics and in data sovereignty, not just individuals. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, Dr. Wieman.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks to Elder Bryce for opening us in a good way. And I guess maybe just to add on and come around, link it back to what Krystal said. You know, the whole issue of data sovereignty and Indigenous health research, and when I'm located here in Canada, so, you know, we use a distinction-based approach. So when I say Indigenous, I mean First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. You know, there's a long history, and I think Krystal covered it in a few sentences, because the similarities between what's happened in Canada and in the States is very similar. There have been, you know, researchers, well-intentioned probably, who just thought they were researching a certain issue, and then just decided to use the samples, biological samples, for a secondary reason that they didn't tell the communities about, or the people, the participants. And then that has led to all kinds of challenges. And then there's researchers years ago who had their own agendas, right? Wanted to research something that they were interested in, but that really the communities weren't necessarily interested in or motivated to study. So, and there's lots of jokes about anthropologists that I won't share. But, you know, this relationship has been challenging, and it's taken, you know, decades of kind of advocacy and work in this area to sort of arrive at where we are now, which is where, depending where you are across the country in Canada, you know, all Indigenous health research in Canada is governed by things such as, you know, the Tri-Council policy statement on the ethics of doing research with Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, Inuit. And there's certain standards that one has to adhere to. And then conversely, you know, the First Nations, in the case of where I work in the province of British Columbia, you know, we have data sharing agreements with our provincial partners, for example, but the First Nations information is very much under First Nations control. So it doesn't get shared with just anybody who wants access. And this became, you know, pretty clear in the last while during COVID, for example, where we were able to link, you know, epidemiologic data, like surveillance data, with First Nations identifying information that's kept confidential, but we can link to individuals. So we would, for example, know who tested positive in a provincial laboratory. And the communities wanted, obviously, to have that information because they wanted to be able to, you know, either bolster their public health measures that they had in place, and do everything they could to keep elders and people with, you know, who were clinically considered vulnerable safe. But then, for example, other people might have wanted that information to say, oh, these particular people are more, and then I'm using vulnerable in kind of a negative connotation, are more vulnerable to an infectious disease, for example, or people don't want their data used in a deficit-based way. And I think that's sometimes what has happened in the past is, health research is focused on what the problems are. But from here where I sit at First Nations Health Authority, we use health data and different types of data to help communities with the questions that they want answered, to be able to work in partnership, provide that data, and help them, say, for example, develop health services or things that they are interested in, that they feel will benefit their health. And that's kind of taking it back to what Krystal said about self-determination and data sovereignty. And here in British Columbia, in some ways, we have actual legislation now that adheres to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and an action plan that's underway that includes things like data sovereignty and research.
Thank you. Bryce, did you want to contribute anything to this first part of thinking about data sovereignty or self-determination?
Not at the moment, Louise. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll come back around to you. We have lots more to ask you about. I want to think a little bit about what data sovereignty might look like for brain data and whether that might be different from other types of data. So Dr. Tsosie works with genomic data. We are talking a bit about gathering, for example, COVID test information, stories from communities, Indigenous knowledges. So for example, there are brain biobanks that collect, for example, MRI images. So you can take a large amount of MRIs of people who are considered healthy and compare them to a large number of MRIs of people who have a common brain disorder like Alzheimer's disease. And using all that data, you could track, for example, the progression of the disease over the years. So it can be really helpful in research, and other brain biobanks would collect actual brains. So I discovered the other day that the Douglas Bell Canada Brain Bank at McGill University has over 3,500 human brains. And I haven't found any information around consultation with Indigenous communities around brain biobanking. Dr. Tsosie, from our chat earlier, it sounded like this might be an important next area for Canada or other nations to move towards. I'm wondering, comment on that, or maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the Native BioData Consortium, what the model looks like there, to help us think about what a similar consortium for brain data might look like.
Yeah, thank you. So the Native BioData Consortium is the US's first Indigenous-led biological data repository. We operate within the geographic and legal jurisdictional bounds of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So we do not do any research without permissions of the tribe that we work with. And we actually operate within a model of dynamic consent and also 2 layers of consent as well. What I mean by dynamic consent is too often researchers in the past have misused broad consenting. So they would consent tribal participants at one time for basically unfettered future access and use of their data for the usually like the greater good of science and research, but then they overinterpret and take too much agency in defining on what that means. And they might research things that be harmful to Indigenous peoples, or frankly have nothing to do with us and can in no way benefit us. So we operate under dynamic consent, in which we we provide participants the opportunity to consent or deconsent or unconsent as many times as possible, as long as their samples and data are banked with us, and they can remove it at any time. And they can change their preferences too as to what kinds of studies they would like their studies to be part of or not be a part of. And then also we operate under 2 layers of consent, individual and also group consent. This is really important because I'm thankful to have been important in reigniting this interest, especially related to genomics data. So Western science operates way too much in the framework of individual informed consent. It centers standard informed consent language on the balance of risks and benefits to the person. And that model worked in the 1970s, for instance, when we didn't have as much of an ability to interrogate as much detail that's perhaps invasive on a person's and group's privacy as much as we do now. Nowadays, in particular, biological data doesn't just re-identify one person, it re-identifies everyone we're related to. So if you're talking about a member of a small Indigenous community, you know, we have a lot of cousins. I have like 60 first cousins. I can't tell you how many third cousins I have. That's potentially a huge portion of our community, right? By one person's DNA. So there's a notion of group risk here and group re-identifiability when you can make perhaps dangerous suppositions about a group based off of one person's DNA. And that has concerns, especially for tribes and indigenous peoples whose rights are tied by the unfortunate necessity of federal and colonial governments recognizing our authority to exist. So treaty rights and our rights to resources and access to things are sometimes tied, unfortunately, to our Indigenous identity vis-a-vis a political identity, even though it's beyond that. And then it also opens up to genomic racial profiling as well and other types of profiling. And it's of concern because these individual versus group consent issues are sometimes used against us. So in this case, you know, we could talk about community-based participatory research and community-engaged research techniques as much as we want, but we have to face the fact that our people have been economically and forcibly displaced and removed off of our traditional homelands, such that in the US, over 3/4 of Indigenous peoples reside outside of reservations. So we can place protections at the community level, but then it doesn't stop researchers, unscrupulous ones, from just opening up a van right outside of our tribal lands to recruit us. So what this means in terms of brain banks and even public data is that there's also this artificial boundary between what constitutes research data, biomedical research, which is more regulated in their sanctions if they're violations, versus public data, and even treating public data as a public good. And that doesn't require the same level of consenting. And it also doesn't require the same amount of research oversight, and doesn't require like if there's sanctions, it doesn't usually fall to an individual researcher or institution. And data harmonization, as mentioned earlier, that's a huge issue because now we have people who are just trying to harmonize across all different types of data sets to fill in the gaps, so to speak, to fill in those informations that community members don't willingly provide, like group identifiers and tribal affiliations, and they're able to link that to other forms of data and make suppositions against us. Now we're talking about brain biobanks, for instance. Those are usually from individuals who, I think the initial cohort of individuals for that brain biobank that you mentioned were actually motorcycle victims. So those were actually, you know, people who unfortunately expired on non-tribal jurisdictions, and it could be Indigenous peoples whose data is being banked. During COVID, we don't know the true numbers or extent of COVID in Indigenous peoples because of the numbers of people that unfortunately expired outside of the tribal lands and whose data is being utilized by researchers everywhere. So we have a lot of these issues related to group identifiability, harmonization, and you know, when researchers and entities call for open access data, you know, they're asking for an overexertion and a claim to data that perhaps oversteps and does not respect Indigenous data sovereignties.
Okay. Does anyone want to take on this question next around imagining what this might look like for brain biobanks and so on moving forward, considering this important work of the Native BioData Consortium. I love these terms. This term dynamic consent isn't one that's in my vocabulary. I'll be adding that. Yeah. Dr. Wieman, I'm not sure if as a psychiatrist you've ever been involved in the brain data side of things, or you've been mostly involved in the clinical side.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been involved necessarily in that type of research. I have been involved in research involving suicide risk. And the area of psychiatry, really, I mean, there are, many different areas that use brain imaging, for example, as part of studies, comparing, for example, depressed brains of people with depression versus people without depression. Should be clear and more accurate. But I think, again, just to answer briefly, I think, and I spoke about it earlier, is, all of this has to do with, the trust and mistrust that has been generated over decades. And I'll go back to the point about, I think, if, for example, I think people shouldn't have a stereotype in their mind either that First Nations or Indigenous communities aren't interested in this kind of research. They might be, but it would have to come from those communities, right? Some communities are in that would be a priority for them. And for other communities, like Sekani was talking about, that may or may not be a priority. And so I think that's the issue around self-determination, but the use of research for the purposes of informing health or health services or the status of health, that using it as an indicator of health or not. But I think it has to come from the community, because historically that hasn't happened. And so unfortunately, we still, I think, are, it's getting better over time, but we are in a situation where communities, to a certain extent, and I don't want to generalize, feel kind of over-researched and feel that they haven't been involved in determining the direction of the health research or what's being studied. So I think I'll leave it at that. Sekani, I think, has her hand up.
Okay. Maybe just like looking at it from like a social justice kind of field. I think that definitely it's good to research and for us to know and to hold our own wellness so that we're able to support each other, right? But there's also sorry, I lost my train of thought. My dog keeps barking. I don't know if you folks can hear it, but it's barking out back. There's also the fact of like, I'll tie it to kind of what's currently happening, like what happened in Kamloops with the discovery of the 215 little ones, right? Like a lot of those folks in that community, and I heard from residential school survivors like my parents and my grandma, that there were terrible things happening. And they just were not believed, until like technology verified that. And then the whole world lit on fire and started looking at that. So there's something about like, okay, well, we're not going to really believe you until we have some verified, Western data to back it up. But it's also good to know. But I mean, like, for us to look at, like, I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I know how this has affected my brain and the way I view the world and my wellness, right? There's something about like, being able to be believed. And if you look at the stats and the data, Indigenous folks are disproportionately in the numbers of homelessness. You know, we're like, what was 5%? I don't know, it was 5 or 3% the last of the entire population of Canada. And we're at 50% or above on most of these issues around social justice, homelessness, drug use. You know, we clearly mentally, we are suffering. You know, a lot of us are suffering, right? So clearly, that's clear. You know, for me, that's something that doesn't need to be proved, but I know how. Like, I've worked in nonprofits many, many times, and funding was always a huge issue. We always had to get proof, and it had to be the proof that they wanted, which was usually research, right? And oftentimes, like, people were doing really unethical things when they were doing research. You know, especially with demographics that we were serving. All the people we were serving were homeless, caught up in many cycles of substance misuse and a lot of trauma, holding a lot of trauma. So oftentimes, I've always felt like doing this research, you know, I say that I'm a peer because I have the knowledge, but I am so far now because I've gained a lot of privilege in my life from the people that I consider my peers. Like, I understand where they're coming from, but I'm in a position to where I'm able to be stable. I've been stable for many years. I've had the same household, the same phone number for, oh God, 7 years. And I'm like, you know, I'm patting myself on the back, but I'm also acknowledging that that's a huge privilege among the people that I've walked beside, you know. So, you know, there's something about that there. And I think when we move forward, you know, we're always going to be moving forward. We can't go back because business as usual has got us to where we are. You know, we're done with business as usual, you know. Going forward, we also have to start pressing like funders, because I believe on the other side of this research, that's what happens, is the people go, okay, well, we'll fund you because we believe you now. I'm saying, believe us now. And you know, I agree, there's so much research out there on us already.
Bryce, go ahead.
Yes. I have a daughter who's teaching on a First Nations reserve up in Port Hardy, and she's dealing with a lot of children who are FASD and have a lot of other problems. And teaching, she said that she's found out that she's also trained to be, 6 years ago, she took a course on outdoor education. And she found that having the kids outside changed their whole demeanor. They became more attentive. And whereas in the classroom, it was, you know, sometimes could be pretty chaotic. Whereas out in the field, on the land, they are totally different. And I have seen this myself, being an elder in residence in the schools district here. I'm in the elementary school, and some of these kids, they're pretty wild. Some of them in the classroom, but then when you get them outside on a field trip out in the woods, their whole demeanor changes, you know. So I feel that you have to get them out on the land to help them out. Thank you.
Elder Bryce, maybe you could tell us a little more about kind of coming from that. And you shared in our working group about spending time in nature for mental wellness. You shared some tips with us. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that here.
Okay, one of the things I've done with the class, one particular class that I really enjoy, is using your senses. The kids, this is the grade 4 or 5 level, and some of them don't realize they have all these senses of how to use that. They're attached to their devices, and you know, what they see in town, it's traffic and all this. It's all natural to them. But to really go out and use their senses out in nature, to take them out on walks and trying to keep them, you know, first of all, trying to keep them quiet so they can hear what's out there. Listen to the leaves falling in the fall. Can you hear the leaf hitting the ground? Listen, open your ears. where are the birds? Where's that bird singing from? You know, is he over here? Over the, you know, pinpoint exactly for the direction the bird is coming from. Listening to the wind, using all your senses. There's smell. As you're walking through the woods, you have all these different smells. You know, the fresh, even the dirt that you're walking on has an odor. Smell that. Smell the trees. So I have the kids going up to cedar trees and smelling them, and smelling the fir trees and the different trees, just to use them in a different manner than what they see every day in school. And you know, at the beginning of the year, it's a little bit chaotic, but towards the end of the year, it really makes a difference. You can really see the change in them, and to the point where they will point things out to me that I had pointed out to them earlier on in the fall, and then come down to the spring and, oh yes, this, you know, so you can see that it has affected them. So I believe that getting out in the land and using your senses, because that's the way I was brought up when I was very young, was to use your senses. You know, that would say, be quiet. Why? There's birds singing over there. There's a rabbit over there. You know, you want to see all these things. So I feel that's, you know, for your well-being, getting out in nature, out in the woods, and just walking, maybe just laying down, the act of laying down, closing your eyes, and just being at peace with yourself. I think that's really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. King, do you want to make a comment there?
First of all, a lot of good thoughts from Nell and Sekani and Bryce. I'd like to go back to communities and their priorities, because that's really super important in all of this. So Alexander King and I do research with communities in Saskatchewan, and it's about wellness. What does wellness mean in a particular community, and how would they like to approach improving their wellness? Because I think every community appreciates their wellness and wants to do something to maintain and improve it. And each community is different. Each community has a different idea. Some communities want the connections and the understanding of their language, and revitalization of that language is important. Other communities, in fact, many, of course, have connections with the land they live on, but the land is different everywhere. It's never the same. So, and that's important to remember. And then there's other communities that might have specific issues like diabetes or heart disease. So it is really important, and really our ethics guides us in this. We need to listen to our communities and their voices and what we do. And we can't just go in as a researcher and impose what we want to do. So thanks.
Thanks, Dr. King. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about patient-oriented research as a framework you work within to promote this kind of collaboration with communities and centering community voices.
Well, thanks for asking. So I am in my day job a scientific director for patient-oriented research in Saskatchewan. And that's actually an interesting thing, because it's an area that's relatively new in health research, bringing the patient voice actively to research. We really encourage and we provide mentorship and training to patients to enable them to be more effective partners in research, not just the academic system and the health system, but the patient. And this is not something new in Indigenous health. I mean, I think we've been doing it forever. Certainly, we've been doing it since I can remember. That the patient voice as part of the community. So I see this as a real interaction between community-centered research in Indigenous context and patients. So, but one point that I need to make, and I do make this in meetings with the funders and with institutions, we need to provide proper resources to patients to enable them to be effective partners in research. And we need to provide effective resources to our community partners, to Indigenous communities, to other equity-seeking communities, to enable them to be effective partners in research. And I would like our institutions to recognize this. Thanks. Sorry, that I should add, because maybe not everyone appreciates it, that lived and living experience is the key to this. People in communities have a unique perspective, a unique contribution to research that the health professionals and the researchers don't have. They've got the living experience with whatever it is that's important, and you need that part to go into the research. Thanks.
Absolutely. I think next we can talk about two examples of projects that incorporate some of these factors that we've talked about and are being talked about in the discussion in the chat as well. So one is the Indigenous Brain Wellness and Mental Health Working Group project, which is a project that Dr. Wieman, Sekani, Bryce, Malcolm, and Dr. Judy Illes, who's the director of Neuroethics Canada, who's on the call, and actually a few others on the call are members of that working group that we set up last year. So that was a collaborative working group that explored over 3 meetings the question of the meaning of brain wellness in an Indigenous health context as a question that hadn't really been hashed out yet. And we created the group with 20 people from our networks of relationships, mostly Indigenous people, and taking from this these principles around patient-oriented research. We had a tripartite sort of public health leaders, healthcare providers, researchers, and community members to have different voices around the table. And those were some really interesting discussions, and Elder Bryce, as well as Elder Sharon Brass, led sharing circles at each of the meetings for that. The one thing that comes up sometimes in talking about research is that research methods can be a black box to people outside of academia. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about what putting together these kind of projects looks like. I saw in the chat Mary mentioning about onboarding trust, so building trust in research projects, and then also maintaining relationships long-term, an offboarding process. That was a really interesting way to phrase that. Yes, let's demystify the black boxes. Thanks, Mary. Did anyone want to weigh in a little bit on the experience in the working group, or Malcolm on the method we put together? Bryce, for you, it led to an interesting development, which was being new to the area of thinking about brain health, but now having joined as a member of the Indigenous Knowledge Holders Group at the Canadian Brain Research Strategy. So I know for some people it has taken taken different directions. Sekani talked in those meetings about visions for conversations with your community around brain wellness and health and bringing the community together. Maybe you could share a little bit about your vision with us for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe I can just speak a little bit to what Mary A was mentioning. Definitely, like, I've done a lot of research on social justice issues in the Downtown East Side, which most of us know here. The Downtown East Side is one of the most researched on communities in BC, if not Canada. They've just developed a Research 101, so they've developed their own ethics that is included in with the ethics that are already out here. Right, we've the community has developed their own ethics, so it'd be good to check that out. Research 101. But yeah, that trust, it's never there, you know, and you know, with you, if you think of our relationship, Indigenous relationship, like I can think of, you know, at least 5 family members that were sterilized, you know, meaning that they cannot have babies anymore in school. That was not what they signed up for. That was not what they didn't know what they were doing. They were children, right? So we think of like that relationship to now, and we're trying really hard to, because I do believe that there's definitely some value in knowing, like if I bring it back to myself, like I have complex PTSD. It would be very valuable to know, like, how did that affect my brain, and what kind of programs can we develop so that my next generation is able to be served and supported in a good way, right? And when I think of like the community as a whole, that talk around like there's something we do at FNHA when we do some workshops that are targeted toward like the community as a general. It goes through our communications department, and all our material is set at a certain grade level, you know, at a grade 5 level, so that we are able to reach more people. So we're bringing everybody into the conversation. But after you know, after going to some of my band meetings, and some of our elders are talking about how important it is for us to use our language when we're talking about issues at a community level, because we're very privileged, and there are a lot of first speakers, meaning that they spoke our language first before English. So they don't talk in English all the time. So whenever there's like a new word that comes up, or a new phrase or a new slang, they don't understand. They're like, what does that mean? You know, just even little things around social media. But when I think about having that conversation, I often think about, you know, how do we pass it through comms? Who are we serving? Why are we serving them? And the idea of like, when we're doing research, of reciprocity, you know, am I just going to write this paper on researching all these folks, and then I'm going to get kudos, and I'm going to get tons of job offers, and I'm going to live an awesome life, and my name is going to be on all these documents everywhere, right? And then the community, you look back and they're still at the same spot I left them at 10 years ago. And it's like, to me, that is unethical, you know. But how do we like walk in both worlds, you know, of honoring our tradition and Indigenous people, but also going, well, we need this data for wellness. It's very valuable to us, right? Thanks.
Dr. Tsosie, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the public deliberation project you were involved with. Had some similarity to the working group project, and so I found it super interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. Just to orient everybody on what the deliberative method is, or democratic deliberation is, because it's something that I actually learned about, and I'm a qualitative researcher myself. So in qualitative methods, particularly in ethnography, we are familiar with interviews, we are familiar with focus groups, and also surveys. Focus groups in particular convene multiple cohorts of individuals, and you have a standardized question, and it's very unidirectional. It's researchers asking the focus group participants a set form, a protocol of questions, and they're trying to basically gain a representative of viewpoints, but it's really ultimately based off of what researchers are interested in interrogating from the individuals. The democratic deliberation method is based off of public town hall meetings, and it's really meant to facilitate a discussion by the deliberants. And really the researchers are supposed to be sort of almost a fly on the wall. They're meant to sort of frame the question and then sit back and let the participants really deep dive into what all of the interests and thoughts and perspectives are related to a topic. So for geneticists in particular, they are horrible at these qualitative methods, and they usually do them very terribly. They'll basically have a very poor survey, and it's very clunkily done. And of course, it will usually support whatever misinterpretations or misunderstandings they have, or misgeneralizations about Indigenous peoples they have prior to the research. And nobody questions it because it's peer reviewed, and other geneticists don't know how to evaluate qualitative research. So that's my aside on how qualitative research is poorly done in general by geneticists. That is to say, though, Indigenous researchers have been doing qualitative research methods very well. Like, for instance, when community-based participatory research methods were starting in action research and in environmental justice research in the 70s, Indigenous peoples were right on it. Like, Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous research methodologies were really put forward by Maori academics, right? And then we in our hemisphere are a couple decades later, that is to say. But I'm really happy when we work with Indigenous community researchers who really know how to use these methods and use them well. So the publication that Louise mentioned was actually using the deliberative approach in looking at asking Alaska Native community members questions about direct benefits to research. They also utilize the same methods in the community that I work with, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, to ask about data governance and what that should look like. And then in Oklahoma, they also did a similar approach and asked a question that was really specific to the Oklahoma communities as well. So what I can speak a little bit more to the Cheyenne River experience, just because I was a part of that particular component. It was really first and foremost like introducing this new methodological approach to non-Indigenous researchers, but then also really treating the Indigenous participants and members as the experts that they are. And it's really great because when you have Indigenous peoples leading the conversations, we do what we've always done, which is really train and teach others. And at least in this time, we're able to have it documented that this comes from Indigenous perspectives and wisdoms and lived experiences first. Was there something specific that you wanted me to point out beyond the methods, Louise? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was very neat. So the public deliberation is based in like Western democratic kind of ideas. So I was, so a lot of the research that has been done there is like based in that Western philosophical framework. So I was so interested to read how the paper adapt to being culturally safe and to elevating community voices.
Yeah, no, thank you. So what we did was, first of all, we had a cultural grounding. We had framed first creating as much as we can a safe space for these conversations to occur. And then we also gave the participants the tools to take over the conversation. And even if that meant kicking non-Indigenous peoples out of conversations that they fundamentally did not belong to, And it was really more about, with research, the object is usually like testing a hypothesis. And again, it's usually something the researchers already pre-assumed. In this instance, it was meant to create an output that was beneficial to communities. So again, for the community that I work with, when we were talking about data governance, we really want to come up with a data governance framework or a model that was created by the community members themselves to implement in their own community. And we're able to do that over a day and a half of in-depth conversations. And it was so successful that I think we're definitely going to do that, use that approach again.
So interesting. Dr. Wieman, I was wondering, in our working group, one really interesting thing you shared was about coming out of medical school with the Western training as a psychiatrist, and then going into Métis Nation community and working with community members, and kind of the learning curve that involved, and working with the elders in the community. Kind of that same thread of bringing together the Western approaches and Indigenous community values and sovereignty and voices. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. You know, the community that I ended up practicing in for the first 8 years, which was a reserve community, you know, they were the ones who came up with the idea of having a mental health clinic. And I just merely kind of joined in and helped plan and provided services there. And I think, you know, I have said over the years, you know, I came out of my psychiatry training knowing about 50% of what I needed to do my job. And part of what I do now is in the area of what we call cultural safety. And cultural safety is an outcome of providing better healthcare services that are free of racism and discrimination. But cultural humility is how we get there. So having that cultural humility of placing oneself as a learner when it comes to someone else's experience. So I think because of my background, you know, I'm a 60 scoop survivor, how I grew up, you know, I had that sort of intuitive sense of cultural humility. I mean, I'm from the Anishinaabe Nation. I was working with the Haudenosaunee Nation. So I couldn't pretend to know anything about the nations and their culture and ceremonies, etc. So I was as much a learner as anybody else that might have been coming to work in that community. And so I think, you know, having that cultural humility is really important. And it's also important for health researchers. And I think I had seen it earlier up in the chat during this panel that someone had mentioned, you know, that relationship building takes a lot of time. And it took that amount of time when I worked in the community. So for example, you know, the first maybe couple of months, we had a few patients come forward, but, you know, psychiatry has a pretty bad reputation actually for cultural safety. So, you know, word would kind of get out and finally people started coming and they'd be, you know, pretty straightforward going, you know, people have been talking and you seem like you're okay. So now I'm going to come see you. You know, it was sort of like once a few people had tested me out and realized that, you know, I was all right, then people felt comfortable coming forward and seeking care. But the bottom line is for clinical services, and I think for, you know, what we've all been talking about this evening is that cultural safety of health services and of health researchers means that if you really change the way you think about it, we're not just meeting the same standard of quality or care by incorporating or by respecting Indigenous knowledge and ways of being and knowing, we are exceeding that quality of care in services and in the research that's produced. So it's a win-win.
Thank you. That concept of exceeding those standards of care and exceeding those ethics standards in research is one that you brought to the group that really has stuck with me and I've thought a lot about. Dr. Tsosie, you mentioned on Monday as well about ethics is not everything in terms of we don't, you know, kind of, you talked about some of the problems around when a best standard practice is set out, it becomes like a bare minimum. Thought that was a useful thread.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a slight pet peeve of mine is biomedical researchers. Again, I'm not, maybe I'm doing adequate justice to biomedical researchers considering their histories of harm on us, but I feel like I'm just constantly lambasting them on this call, which is fine because they have a lot to answer to, and also I've dealt a lot with a lot of them. But biomedical researchers in particular, whenever they submit grants, they utilize Indigenous peoples and diversity as buzzwords, but another word that they use as a buzzword is ethical, right? We're going to advance ethics. And they do it in a very normative way and a very almost slapping on, like, what's the bare minimum that we can do to make this seem ethical? Just like what's the bare minimum number of Indigenous peoples that we can recruit to our studies to make it seem like we're actually do justice to diversity. But so the term best practices gets thrown around a lot. Like, let's create a standard series of best practices, and I don't like it because it becomes the ethical floor. It becomes like a bare minimum checkbox. Like, what's the bare minimum that I can do in order to have my research be deemed ethical as opposed to unethical? And we have to really be thinking about, first of all, we should always be challenging, ensuring that we are always improving, right? And so that floor should always be shifting. What's considered standard practice 20 years ago is definitely shouldn't be considered a standard practice now. And this is actually something that older, more established non-Indigenous researchers have a hard time doing. I unfortunately have had an experience where somebody that I was not training under, but working with, who was in charge of mentoring Indigenous students, would actually tell them ethics is a waste of time. Basically, he felt that the time that it took to actually adequately engage communities took much distracted from the research process, i.e. the extraction of data from our peoples. But it just annoyed me that he thought that it was not useful. But really, honestly, just like we are constantly training researchers to adapt research methods, such as like what's the latest in sequencing, what's the latest in statistical tools, we should also be asking ourselves, what's the latest in the ethical tools? Because that's part of our toolbox as well as researchers. And we really should be thinking about this in terms of our praxis and how we conduct ourselves as researchers.
Nice. Sekani, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about some of your experiences with externally imposed programs. So in the community, you talked about, for example, a mental health worker that's sent into the community, and they ask, why aren't the community members, visiting this counselor we sent in that's supposed to solve the requests for more support around mental wellness? Could you talk a little bit about that from the community-based side?
Yeah, sure. And Dr. Wieman touched on it. It's a matter of trust, right? I find that with the community I live in the north. Well, I don't know. They consider I live in the north, the Northern Health Region, small community, 2 hours away from the nearest eye doctor, right? But it's a matter of trust, and I find that a lot of folks come here with good intentions, and I always say, I wish I could live on good intentions, but dear, I need food, and they come on this basis of like, they're doing I call it a bit, because they come here and they do their bare minimum, and they come and they do like, oh, we have to do 1 year of counseling before I get my degree or whatever. They're just meeting these standards that are set out not by them, they're set out for them, and they're really set up so that a lot of folks like us in the north, it's set up to fail because the continuum of care really drops. So if I'm talking to a counselor and it takes me a year, and a year to feel comfortable with them, to tell them the full truth, and then a new person comes in, right? That continuum of care just ends right there. But it's a huge issue, and our nation is like trying to address it right now, and many of our smallies are trying to address that, because one of the things is always housing. Like, these things play off each other. There's no housing there, right? There's not even enough housing for our people, let alone people who work there, right? They're trying to address it, and they're trying to figure out, how do we do this, and then there's also like living away from the nearest eye doctor or the nearest chiropractor is not feasible, right? And our emergency, the nearest emergency to my community is a 2-hour drive, and that one closes sometimes. They close the emergency room sometimes. So you're directed to go to the next one, which is in Vanderbilt, which would be a 4-hour drive away in an emergency situation, right? So we're talking about communities that are already underserved, right? And I think I've mentioned this before. I feel like I'm like a huge echo, but when we think of how important it is to have those counselors there and to have that continuum of care, I'm really imploring, because I know there are some folks on here who are in school right now, to come work for our nation, come work for our communities, and find a way. I used to fantasize about living in a trailer, like a motorhome. I think I want to, because then I can go park by my nation in the summer and then go park at Walmart in the winter. Thanks.
Thanks. So I think I'm going to start opening up for questions, but I want to see if any of the panelists had anything they wanted to squeeze in, or Dr. King, anything around ethics around working with Indigenous communities, or any of these topics here.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First of all, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network changed the dialogue around best practices some years ago, and they talk about wise practices. And I think that's a very important thing. There's never going to be a best practice, because it's always, so we also talk about developing and good practices. But the other comment I would make is around ethics. We've heard about the ethical imperatives that researchers face, and it really is important. We can't go working with the community and then just leave them. We have to continue. And if we can't continue ourselves, I think we need to find someone to hand off to. Like if you go as a lung disease or heart disease researcher, and then find out that the community really needs to deal with mental health issues, it's up to the researcher to come up with somebody who can then continue with that community in what's really important to them. So I guess I would do all with a paraphrase from the late Vince Lombardi, the football coach, that ethics isn't everything, it's the only thing. I think, and probably most of you are too young to even know that Vince Lombardi was, but anyway, ethics is really important. So thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you. Has anyone in the audience got any questions or panelist questions for each other? Oh yes, I see a hand. Carol Marie Bishop.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can. I'm a psychologist, and I worked in the hospital for 27 years. I did a lot of research on pain and neuropsychology, and the issues of ethics were so difficult. People really didn't understand what was happening, and I so commend all of the First Nations people for being so thoughtful about how to proceed and how to include people and make them part of the process, because they are the process, actually. And I think that even we white kids deserve to have the same kind of thinking and care for any research project that anyone is ever exposed to. So thank you so much for everything you're doing here. It's exciting.
I liked what Dr. Nadine Caron said in our event on Monday about, she just said she's so proud of Indigenous communities for Indigenous research methodologies and Indigenous ethics really being at the forefront of respectfully engaging with people. I think you.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, Louise, if I could just add, I think in addition to that, I think Krystal had mentioned it way, way up at the top of the chat. You know, I think we're reaching a point now where we're starting to have more representation within these different health fields. You know, as, you know, the first, you know, Indigenous geneticist, or you know, way back when, I don't want to say how far back I went to medical school, but it was suffice to say the internet, I don't think had been invented yet. And when I did my training, the only other Indigenous psychiatrist in the country, Dr. Claire Brandt from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, he died 2 years into my specialty training. So there was no other Indigenous psychiatrist at that time. But now, well, for psychiatry, we haven't really come that far. We probably have maybe 20, 25, maybe. I don't know who everybody is. But, you know, we are training Indigenous health researchers. We're training, you know, different specialists in the field of medicine. There's a First Nations bioethicist I know who lives in Toronto. So we're getting more representation in the various fields, although not probably proportional, like if we look at proportional to the population. But I think we're making advances slowly, but surely. Like BC, for example, I think has graduated 120 Indigenous physicians in the last 12 years or something like that. Like it's a big amount compared to some other places. And then I think the next step, though, is advocating for, and you know, Indigenous health professionals and others, I mean, regulated and unregulated, to start assuming positions of leadership within different health systems. And that includes people with lived and living experience, because we all are experts at ourselves. That's about the extent to which we can be an expert in something. So I think, you know, I don't want to be despairing and say, you know, this has taken us so long, because it actually kind of has. But, you know, if I wasn't hopeful, then I would be despairing. So I choose to be hopeful and say that things, you know, are changing. We continue to advocate for that. But I think especially when we think of, you know, sort of changing health systems, we need that representation there. We need people with a variety of skill sets, and we need people with lived and living experiences.
Dr. Tsosie, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, kind of related to this. On Monday, you mentioned the organizational structure at the Native BioData Consortium and how the board of directors is answerable to the Community Advisory Board. I thought that was really neat, and I wanted to hear more about that. Maybe I can squeeze that in at this moment.
Okay, I'll try. So the Native BioData Consortium, NBDC, is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we have to adopt a structure that the IRS likes, because we have to pass audits every now and then that allows us to operate. And a traditional board has, you know, executive members, president, vice president, whatever, and then members that are voting. For us, our board is comprised of Indigenous scientists and community leaders and community members that represent the communities that we partner with. And then, non-Indigenous experts, people with specialized knowledge related to legal, state law, and like biobanking or whatever, they don't get a vote. They're called board advisors though. We rely on their expertise from time to time, but we ensure that they actually have no overall role in our governance. But equivalent to our board of directors, we have established a community advisory board, or a CAB group. And these are people who are cultural experts, community members. They are knowledge keepers from the communities that we work with. And our board is answerable to them. And they have oversight over all the research questions that we want to engage. And we use them as our first, I don't want to call focus group, but our first group of experts that we ask to consult with in terms of, is this something that's appropriate? And this is great because too often research questions are done by non-Indigenous researchers who are outside to our communities, that honestly have their own like pet phenotypes, their own research questions that they kind of just want to recruit Indigenous peoples like as almost another covariate in their models. And they don't really care about whether or not their research question is even of interest to us. And they're also really poorly informed by their own narrow perspective of how Indigenous peoples live. So the best people to inform research questions that are about us are ultimately us. So the best people to inform other factors related to health disparities, including colonial factors, environmental factors, and also traditional threats to our lifestyle, are the people that have lived in their traditional homelands for time immemorial. So they enrich their research projects. They are also ones to posit research that interests them. So if we're talking about like wanting to ensure that research directly benefits communities, then you need to have community members at the plate. So that's kind of our model, is to ensure that we have Indigenous community members and elders that we answer to first for their expertise, and then we want to ensure that the research benefits them.
Thanks. The question in the chat, Dr. Tsosie, that could be towards you, or Dr. Wieman, you mentioned around COVID testing. I'm not sure if this has been a challenge or an issue which has been identified in terms of linking that data back to specific communities, or if the person who asked it would like to come on and elaborate. Yes.
Hi. Hi. Oh no, yes. So I asked the question, and I was just really, I work with a lot of First Nations data within Alberta, and one of the things that communities want is they want their data, their community specific data, but how they're kind of housed or identified in data sets is usually only at the First Nations level. So I'm just curious if like that's an issue with like, the brain banks that you were talking about. Are we identified in those? Or because if communities want their data, can we be able to do that? Oh, and same with like the gene sequencing, I know that was like identifiable, like really off the bat, you said a whole family could be identified. I'm curious if there's been like the sequencing part, I guess. So that's two-part question. So whichever we have time for.
Yeah, great piece there.
Well, who's that question directed to? Anyone? Because I'd like Dr. Wieman's response. I'm interested in her response.
Yes, anyone.
Well, I think I can at least start off. I think it really varies, to be honest. Like my experience is not with biobanks per se. And for particular research projects that may be linked with, say, an academic institution, but still adhering to the principles of conducting research with, Indigenous or First Nations communities, that kind of research data, it varies depending on the study, and I don't have specific knowledge of that. However, you were mentioning that you were in Alberta, and I think one of the things one of the advantages, I suppose, that we have here in British Columbia for First Nations people is we do have the organization where I work, First Nations Health Authority, and we have, you know, worked out data governance and data sharing agreements with the different holders of or collectors of that information. So for example, we would have identifying information in the sense of we have you know, information about who belongs, who's on the membership list of which community. We have their healthcare number, which is the identifier that we would use to link to other data sets in the province. So for example, like I said, as an example, the COVID, when we were testing, when we were much more testing for COVID than we have been over the past couple of months. But another example would be something that Sekani and I work closely on is the toxic drug poisoning crisis here in BC. And so we have linkages with the BC Coroner Service, for example, on who has died of a toxic drug poisoning. And we link that with what we call the First Nations client file. And lots of people want access to that First Nations client file, let me tell you. But we have a very rigorous process here at my health authority, not my health authority, but where I work at First Nations Health Authority, about who gets access to that First Nations client file. So all of the things we've been talking about over the last, you know, hour and a half about establishing protocols. We want to know everything about your research. We want to know what you're going to do with that information. We have to have the permission from people, for example, in certain cases, to use that data, even if it's non-identifiable, for all of the reasons we've talked about, you know, the historical problems, the mistrust, the presenting of information in a deficit-based way, using data for secondary purposes that, you know, you haven't received ethics approval for. So, but by having those linkages, you know, we can start to look at health and wellness over time. And just quickly, one of the things we've done here at First Nations Health Authority is work with communities to come up with indicators of how they envision their health and wellness. So when I say indicator, it's something you measure. So it's like suicide rate or life expectancy. Those are the very basic ones that people use. But First Nations communities here in BC have identified other indicators that they see as very relevant to their health and wellness. For example, the number of language speakers in a community, or the percentage language speakers, or as Elder Bryce was talking about earlier, opportunities to get out on the land or do land-based healing. And so all of these things form that picture of health and wellness. So it's a very different way of looking at things. The only kind of issue with linking all these databases one of the major issues, I should say, is just the time lag. So it takes a lot of time to do these linkages. And so it's hard sometimes in the middle of a global pandemic, for example, to get the information that you need right away or in a timely sort of fashion. And same with the toxic drug poisoning crisis. We do receive monthly data, but we receive it a week or so later than the rest of the province because of the linkage that has to be made with the First Nations client file.
Thank you. That was so interesting, and touch back on what Sekani had said around, you know, First Nations communities working together to have capacity for data governance and sovereignty, and First Nations Health Authority is a great example of that. And we're coming to the end of the event now. I found this really interesting. I hope the participants enjoyed and the panelists as well. I heard about, I liked what Dr. King said about what does wellness mean to a particular community and what do they want to do to improve it. Bryce talking about paying attention to your senses for wellness. we heard about dynamic consent. There's a lot of great stuff discussed here today. So I want to thank you all so much. Thank you especially to the panelists. Thank you again to Neuroethics Canada and to the W. Maurice Young Centre for Applied Ethics.